Yeah.
I'd say the tough times have ebbed and flowed over the last 15 years. So Australia has had many iterations of climate policy. We actually got to what you may call the zenith. We had a national carbon pricing mechanism that covered 350 liable entities that was operating quite successfully, full compliance across all of the companies under the scheme. And then politics came into play, and in a federal election campaign it was polarised around a carbon tax versus household electricity prices, and the change of government to the government that we have today repealed the carbon pricing mechanism, which was for many of the Australian companies and participants in the carbon market definitely a setback in terms of the progress towards using markets to fully optimise our position in terms of our emission reduction strategies.
But you're still here. You haven't closed down. You haven't quit and moved somewhere like South Korea or China, where they are embracing carbon markets. Why are you still working? Why are you still smiling?
My wife said it was a bad career move to take over a couple of years ago the CEO of the Carbon Market Institute. But within that, while many of Australian industry bodies have dumbed down the debate and gone with the government's view that we don't need any pricing mechanisms or regulation, it's opened up the opportunity for the Carbon Market Institute to play a very constructive, independent, authoritative role with policymakers, because the issue is not going away. We may have had a temporary political battle over what mechanism or approach might be appropriate, but the Carbon Market Institute and our membership base has hundreds of years of experience in operations of carbon markets, advising companies or participating under compliance schemes. So we get to draw on that knowledge base, and we get to actually provide a conduit into government thinking. So if we're going to be around for a long time, as this issue is, we've determined we'll work with whoever the government of the day is, and to communicate our members' views so that a market-based approach to emissions reduction can be incorporated in how they implement policy. And what that's done is that actually has got us deep inside the tent. So from a fledgling little nascent industry body, we're now actually quite influential, if you like, in terms of how this is going to play out for the government of the day and in future governments.
How do you compete in a country which is so heavily dominated by major extractors, by huge mining firms, by a vast coal lobby? How do you compete?
I think the main thing to recognise in Australia is that businesses that operate in a global marketplace are very exposed to developments in other markets. So if you take our major trading partner, which is China, and the export market opportunity, which is present continuous, as China moves in towards more rigorous emissions trading schemes and starts looking at the supply chain in terms of where the emissions intensity comes from, it has a real impact on Australia. If you look at Australia's position around coal, clearly the government of the day sees that our Prime Minister has said, coal is king. Now, that's one particular view. However, owners of some of those assets, the large companies, are also looking more pragmatically at a plan for decarbonisation. So even though the government of the day might have a particular view and somewhat, let's say, not open to the developments that are happening in the international business community, many of those big resource companies, many of the large energy intensity companies are actually members of CMI, and they want to actually know what is happening here in Barcelona, what is happening in the developments on the way to Paris. How is the international market going to impact their risk profile when they operate internationally? So it might seem like Australia, which is really quite isolated and far removed, and has a particular economic profile in terms of our primary extractive industries, but those companies within their boards and executive management realise that they're exposed. They also realise that there is going to be some future compliance mechanism come back. This is a temporary blip. And even the government of the day, they're trying to work out the rules of what they call as the safeguard mechanism, which will put a baseline over industry and require industry to procure units to stay below that baseline. And when they start looking at that kind of mechanism, Carbon Market Institute is perfectly placed to provide input on how you can implement that policy so that it actually best, gives business the chance to comply.
How are you going to reframe the debate then? Because when Julia Gillard was Prime Minister, I remember reading part of her biography, and she said she was really angry that the whole carbon markets had been reframed as carbon tax, and that's kind of stuck with a large proportion of the public. How are you going to reframe it and get it away from the idea of a tax and something where you have a market, so in a sense there's a fairer playing field, at least in the perception of the public?
I think that's a great question. How do you reframe the debate in Australia and take it away from the carbon tax? The first point I'd make is the government doesn't want to actually reframe that. The government today wants to keep painting the picture that the opposition is going to bring back the carbon tax. Now that scare campaign is pretty strong. So I think the best answer to the question is we reframe it about where business is actually heading. We're a business association, and businesses involved in the transition to a low carbon economy need to have the appropriate mechanisms. They need to have the appropriate level of investment and innovation and technology pathways that enable them to best survive and optimise their position in a global market. So the way we're reframing the whole debate is around economic growth in a transition to a low carbon economy. So that's our narrative has changed from we need to have a carbon pricing mechanism, or we need to have so we don't sort of lock into any particular type of mechanism, but start broadening the discussion around what is the conditions that the government can put in place that will allow Australian business to thrive in that economic transition. And one of those things is appropriate policy frameworks that are aligned with our trading partners, that give Australian companies the best chance to price carbon, to manage their future exposure and liability, and to actually then make investments accordingly.